All right. And we are back.
Yeah.
So that was deafening. Yeah, we listened to the video here of us talking, all of a sudden just hail. I'm like, I'm not gonna try to shout.
It wasn't huge. I mean, it was pea-sized. We went out and looked, but
which is how our roof is. It just hits it and echoes.
And there was a huge bolt of lightning out the window, so it was like, I think we need to stop for a moment.
Made sure it calmed down.
See how far we get before it starts pouring rain again.
All right, we got our second wave coming through. So we're on let's just restart that question.
Yes. Please define a confessional Lutheran.
That's a good question. So, it's one of those tags you'll see online, and you might wonder, like, what does that even mean, right? What does it mean? Because, I'm Lutheran, but what does it mean to be confessional Lutheran? And when we say that, and I would argue for myself, I'm one of those, it's a way of defining what do I mean when I say I'm Lutheran, right? Because the name Lutheran today perhaps has been watered down. It's taken by some that I would say that's not Lutheran.
Yeah.
When we do that, that's kind of happened, right? We have to define the terms here.
Well, like you get in the news, the largest Lutheran body in America, and they're not very Lutheran.
When you look at that and they say, we're ordaining, homosexuals and women and things like that, and at the LCA, right? And you're like, that's not Lutheran.
Yeah.
So when we talk about being a confessional Lutheran, we're talking about a certain way of being Lutheran. And you go ahead and bring it out here.
It's gonna be backwards again, but
it's backwards. But this is we call this the Christian Book of Concord, and this is our confessions, right? So in this book, there's things like the Augsburg Confession, which is the defining document for us as Lutherans. There's your large and small catechism are in there. You have other things such as the small called articles. You have the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene, the Athanasian. There's 10 documents in there. There's a few more, but I won't name them all. But in this book here, we would say this is what it means when we say I'm a Lutheran, right? So this is guiding how I talk about my faith, because that's what confessions do, right? When Jesus looks at his disciples and say, "Who do you say that I am?" He's asking for a confession, right? And when Jesus is asking for a confession, he's asking for, what do we believe? And so this document, right, these documents that are in here in the Book of Concord, they're teaching us, this is what it means when we talk about being a Lutheran. This is being guided, of course, by here's how we're saved. Here's how Jesus accomplishes our salvation. Here's who God is. And this is part of how the church talks, right? So as I look at things, I'm going to argue things, and I'm going to talk the way this talks. So when I'm saying I'm a confessional Lutheran, the confessions are going to guide the way I think and how I engage in discussions. It just feels a certain way of talking, right? It's kind of like, we'll put it this way. Being an American, right, I'm guided by the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, these defining documents that say canonically, here's what it means to be an American, right? And so when our justice system, for example, takes a look at court cases, it's going to take a look then at the precedents, but it's going to take a look at how the Constitution frames things and says, this is in or this is out. Same thing with our confessions, right? These are defining, here's what's in and here's what's out. Here's how I think about things, here's how I engage it. And that's important, right? Just as it's important that our justice system works with the ideas of the Constitution, so us as Lutherans, this is defining the structure. This defines the language, right? So when all of a sudden Christians are talking about you got to have a relationship with God, with Jesus, I'll say, okay, but that's not how our confessions talk, right? That's kind of how your Protestant American talks, Christian talks. And so that's not going to be the way I talk as a confessional Lutheran, whether that's right or wrong, and there's a way to understand that and talk about that, and that's a different question. But the focus here is that's not how our confessions talk about it, though. So I'm not going to talk that way, right? I have to find a way to engage with that, but that's going to be framed by this. I guess if you want to say, what does it mean to be a confessional Lutheran, define that, is that this defines how I think and talk and engage and be a Christian, right? That's kind of what we're talking about there. What are any thoughts that kind of come from that? I see the wheels turning.
In your ordination vows and when you were installed here, you said you were going to hold to this. We as a church also, this is in our church constitution that we're going to hold to this. I mean, we say, this is normed by the scriptures, of course, because some people will just be like, well, I just believe the Bible, which we've talked about this on here, I think, before, about why we have the confessions in the first place.
But yeah, it's always good to remember, people say that all the time, right? They'll say, well, we just teach what the Bible teaches. And we're like, okay, well, what does it teach about Jesus or baptism or things like that,
and
right?
That's where
and
this
that's what
comes
this is.
in.
Yep.
This says this is what it's basically puts it out systematically. Because you could just, it's like a summary. But, well, I wouldn't say a summary because it's also very big. But
and this is also dealing with the issues, especially as they came up in Luther's day and in the 1500s and even towards the end of it. Right?
Even the Nicene Creed's in there, which is the 300s.
And that's a way of saying that, when the creeds are in here, right? So you got the Apostles, Nicene, and Athanasian. And that's a way of saying that we are in line with this church, that we are the same church that gave this confession in the Nicene Creed. Right, when we engage with issues in our day, right, whether that's like homosexuality or any of the cultural stuff that we are, pitted with in our society today, abortion, right, we are also, there's almost a need for a confession in our day and age about some of these topics that are up there. And it will be in line with this, right? So it's not like we're throwing this out and replacing it with something new. We're saying that the church that confessed this was in line with what the church has always said. And it's in line with what the apostles gave us, right? So that's the one thing about the church. The church is a living entity that is always giving confession of faith, right? And it's always in line with what's come before and what's been received from the scriptures, right? So you mentioned, right, this is normed by the scriptures, right? So this is this takes its cue and says that's what the scriptures are teaching, and that's what we're going to say. And that's what I'm going to say.
We hold ultimately to the scriptures. But we're saying is this says what the scriptures are saying.
Yep. So it's an agreement because the scriptures is teaching the scriptures.
So when we say because I usually define myself as confessional Lutheran. I know I've seen it online where someone's like, I want to, someone might be asking like in a Lutheran group, like, I want to, I'm traveling and I'd like to go to a church that's confessional. And I've seen people like kind of jump on them a little bit, like, well, we're all Lutherans and we're all Christians and it's like, but what they're asking? They're asking for a church that is going to teach the scriptures, that's going to teach what Lutherans have always taught, probably going to use the liturgy.
They want something that looks and sounds Lutheran and not Protestant.
Yes. So that's kind of, it's almost like saying we're conservative Lutheran, but saying confessional is actually a better word than conservative. Because
conservative comes across politically. Right? And that's not what we're trying to say. So confessional is a way of saying we're teaching this.
We're teaching the same thing Lutherans have always taught. We're believing what Lutherans have, and what we would say the church has always taught.
Exactly.
And,
So that's kind of that's kind of the generic. So if you want like a summary of that, right? It's confessional Lutheran is someone who is guided in their thoughts and their language by the confessions of the Lutheran Church, right? Of the Christian Book of Concord. That's how we're understanding that. So in order to do that, you have to know what's in here, right?
Which is why you teach it on Sunday mornings.
Exactly. You got to act this way to know what they say and what they teach, and then live accordingly, right? So because our confessions aren't just something that I think about, and this is how you should think about this rightly, but it then also engages how we are to live, right? That's why things like, this upcoming month here, we're going to be talking about the Nicene Creed a lot more, as 1,700 years since the Nicene Creed began its formulation. And what we want to understand with that is that our confessions aim us in the right direction, right? So the Christians, when they confess the Nicene Creed, where they're saying that this is who God is. And so when we're worshiping, we're directing our worship this way. Because if Jesus isn't the one true God, then I'm worshiping an idol. I'm worshiping a false God. And that means I shouldn't worship Jesus if he's not God, right? That was what the Nicene Creed was trying to hit at and get at home at. The confessions, and it's fun as we teach this in Bible class, they all center around how we are saved, right? It's talking about justification. And the Roman Church in the day was taking things like the sacrament and making it a work that we do for God. They were doing things like you have to work out your salvation by these man-made rites, right? If you want to be sure that you're saved, leave mom and dad and tell them, go fend for yourself. I'm going to become a monk, right? So they're doing all these weird things, buy an indulgence if you want to get spring grandpa out of purgatory, right? Stuff like that as they're looking at it, say, that's not what the scriptures are teaching, right? And so they're hammering this stuff home in their day and age, and that's helping guide us, because a lot of the same way of talking still applies. I was saying to the Bible class, what the Roman Catholic Church does to the Lord's Supper, communion, the Protestant churches today do with baptism, right? They make baptism not something that God is coming to do to me, justification, but rather it's something that I am showing to God as something I'm doing to prove my obedience to him. And so also baptism is becoming my work I'm doing for God and not receiving Christ's work he's done for me, and taking rest and thanks be to God. That's a different way of viewing justification, right? So, and I hit home, I'm like, it's not like our Protestant friends are just saying you can have this opinion and we can have our opinion. What we're saying here is there's a different way of justification, of salvation happening here. And our Protestant friends are saying that God isn't saving in this way. And we're going to go, hold on. Yeah. The scriptures teach that that's how God's working. So these aren't just small little disagreements that we can have our different opinions on.
It's not just a matter of this is your tradition, this is my tradition. Right. It's actually, we're asking, how are you saved?
Yeah, and we're asking, what's God's tradition? What has God handed over to us, right? That's what that word tradition means. It comes from the tradore, right? The hand over. And so what are we handing over? Paul talks that way. What I receive from the Lord, I am also handing over to you. That's the word tradition. That's what we should understand with that. So this is what we have received, and how do we now confess that to the world? So, good. Ooh, what does it say there? Add effects using hand gestures. No, we're not doing that, because then fireworks are going to go off.
We're having issues with our live stream a little bit.
Fun. So I don't know, anything else that comes from, because there's a lot of different tangents we could go from there.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot. I don't even know.
All right.
Because, they're basically... Well, we talked about this a little bit last month with the word evangelical. Mm-hmm. That even the word Lutheran has taken on...
a different
And so you have to clarify what you mean by Lutheran.
Yeah.
And so you can't, like I said, you can't just go out there and say, well, I'm a Lutheran, because a lot of people, their experience with Lutheranism is ELCA or some of the other liberal church bodies who... There goes the rain again. Anyway, who aren't, they don't teach that, the Bible is God's word. It just contains God's word. And that gets into a whole bunch of other wonky stuff that leads them down. I think there's an ELCA church in California that actually prays to
the mother.
The mother.
Yeah.
And technically part of the ELCA still, and they accept that actually.
Yep. That's a different confession of faith.
Yeah, and so when people hear Lutheran, a lot of times people's experience is that, and it's like, no, that is not what
so we need to define ourselves
when we're Lutheran, and so that's why we have to add a qualifier in there and say confessional Lutheran.
I was back on vicarage. I was down in Missouri, and it's heavy Baptist country. And one of the funny things, I was at a breakfast that the community had, and one of my elders was a part of it, so he'd always invite me along. And so I went to it, and I was in line for the breakfast, and I'm the new guy there, and it's like, tell me about yourself, and I say, no, I was the vicar at the Lutheran church in town, and at Holy Cross, and the guy, he's like, he gave me this look, he's like, what kind of Lutheran are you? And because his mind was like, is he looking at an ELCA Lutheran who doesn't believe in the scriptures and all that stuff, and these are just fairy tales? And I'm like, oh no, and I said, I'm Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. He's like, oh, okay, you're one of the good Lutherans. Okay. Right? And that right there.
Are you or was it a different pastor who told me a story at a wedding where someone was like, basically that they were the mean Lutheran?
Yeah, I was the mean Lutheran.
That was you?
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. That was from a few years ago, wasn't it?
So when they asked me and I said, I'm Muslim, I was like, oh, you're one of those strict mean Lutherans. And I'm like, I think the word's faithful, but
Because sometimes people think we're arrogant for that, and it's like, but
we're confident in our confession.
We're holding to the scriptures,
and when you hold to the truth, you don't need to apologize for it, right? You don't need to be like, I'm right and you're wrong, so ha.
No, you don't have to be mean about it, but just holding to it, and because I always say, people are like, well, you about how you're gonna, people tell you this all the time that you're stuck in your ways.
Oh, stuck in
ways,
yeah.
And it's like, but there's certain things you should be stuck in your ways, and that's, when it comes to the scriptures, you should stand on that no matter what.
Well, when it comes to our scriptures and confessions, these are the hills I'm going to stand and die on. One, because I promised I would. Yeah. And I'm not going to budge on that. It's going to be one of those things, like, if you're going to crucify me and hate me, I guess that's what you're going to do. But that's what I've been called to do.
Yeah.
So that's one of those things.
Yeah, I was just thinking, if I didn't believe it was true, then I would believe it. So I'm going to believe it with all my being. Otherwise,
right?
Yeah, there's no point. I'm not going to be wishy-washy about it and be like, well, you could be right too, and I might be right, and I'm not, I always hate that. It's like, just believe it.
Well,
either believe it or don't believe it. Don't be the middle ground.
Notice what Jesus does in Matthew 16 when he talks about that, right? When he's looking at his disciples, and what do they say? Okay, that's not right, because he doesn't praise their confession, right?
Yeah.
It's not adequate enough. So when he looks at Peter and says, but what about you guys? And Peter says, well, you're the Christ, you're the Son of God. And Jesus is like, yeah, the Father told you that. And so you spoke rightly. And what does he say? I'm going to build my church off of that, right? Jesus is looking at his church and saying, I'm going to build my church off of your confession of faith. So when we look at the confessions, when we're looking at the scriptures, right, we should be confident because this is how Jesus is going to build his church. And if we're not confident in that, we're not building a church. Christ is not going to use us to build his kingdom. And so we should be confident. We should say, thus saith the Lord, this is how it is.
We should be, we should be willing to be corrected by the scriptures.
Right.
So if someone comes along and is like, you're wrong, they should be able to prove it by the scriptures and talking, how God talks, not just you're wrong because you're being mean or because I don't believe that, and so you should be.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, when we ever prove points, right, when it comes to theology, when it comes to how we act as a church, right, if the confessions and the scriptures, they're talking this, and if you don't like that, we don't just say, well, I don't prefer that. We say, if this is wrong, then we need to prove that from the scriptures and confessions. If so, well, then we go down this path, right, where you make things right. Yeah. But if you're just, I don't like this, right, well, that doesn't matter, right? My feelings and opinions matter squat when it comes to the scriptures and confessions. What God says is that. Whether men like it or not, it doesn't matter. Yeah. We're to hold to that. So that's a way of thinking. Hey, we're back. All right. Good. So that's where we ended. But let's
try
do
to
this last question. We got one more question.
This one shouldn't take long. The Bible references gold, silken fabric, unique woods, precious stones, and metals repeatedly. My perception is that there were a lot more of these precious items at that time. Is that the case?
That's a good question, right? So I have chapter 26 of the book of Exodus here, right? It says, moreover, you shall make the tabernacle with 10 curtains of fine twined linen, and blue and purple and scarlet yarns. You shall make them with the cherubim skillfully worked into them. The length of each, and it goes into the lengths, and it talks about, and it goes forward too, with the bronze and the gold, and here's all this stuff being made. And whether that's, maybe it is, who knows. God did promise that they would dig in the earth and they would find stuff, right? So he does bless them with that. But what I would say when it refers to the scriptures here is that God always reserves the best for himself, right? God likes things that are well put into his worship, into his buildings, into things that promote that. I had to listen to this podcast. I was going over the book of Hebrews, and it was a guy who was in England, and he had someone who was from Asia who came over to England to study for the semester, and was taking him on a tour. And they came into the church there in England, Canterbury, I think, and came into this beautiful, right, this magnificent building. You're like, whoa, right, it's just gorgeous. And the person who came in there saw this and went, what happens in here, because it must be important. Yeah. That confessed something, right? That says what's happening here is important. So when God has the references to gold and the silk and fabric and the woods, especially as it relates to this, because usually that's where they're put in here, it's referring to God always wants the best to be given for him. And to communicate that. So churches, right, we shouldn't put up some dingy cut-cornered building, right? We do want to put up our best, right?
I mean, if your only option is the old dock that went out of business, then
right, we'll make it work.
But you should always be striving for something better.
Yeah, we always want our best to be given to Christ, and that includes the best materials. And that, because that and all this goes, hey, there we go.
That communicates beauty.
It communicates beauty, and we want that, right? Because God is beautiful, right? He made a great, glorious creation. Why are we building something shoddy that communicates this isn't important, right? All of our government buildings communicate majesty and importance, and there's a reason for that. Yeah. And so when we see that in the Bible, right, it's brought up a lot, usually in reference to the worship life of God's people, and God wants the best for his building.
So the materials weren't necessarily more prevalent, it's just that they used them for worship. Yeah. The best went to the tabernacle and went to the temple later on.
And you got that, even the, it says the color, the scarlet, the blue, and the purple.
Yeah.
Those are expensive, right? Back in the day, you have Lydia in the New Testament, the book of Acts. She's a maker of the linen, the purple linen. Probably she's working for the government, right? And they're having her make the clothes that the government officials would wear. And to do that in her day, the snail's gone now, it's extinct. But you take a snail and it's secreted like a purplish dye, a scarlet color, and you would crack it, you'd break it, and it'd be a little bit of that dye, and you'd use that then to kind of help create the color that the Roman government officials would wear. And so it was expensive because it took a lot of snails to make one garment. And so those kind of colors, when you see that communicates royalty. It's expensive, it's rich taste. And God does reserve those things for the beauty of his space, where people gather to hear of his salvation, to receive his gifts, to praise him. Once again, right, even what you do have access, you're still going to want to do your best, right? Christians in Africa, they might not be able to afford these grand cathedrals, but their spaces for worship are usually of the best material that they have available for that. And that's a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, like even the early church, they worship down in the catacombs or where, wherever, places where Christians are still persecuted and could get arrested for worshiping and gathering.
And even in those spots, they put art.
Yeah.
And they set aside space and they made.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay.
Beauty. We're talking about beauty.
So even church underground will probably try to find their best cup to use for communion. Just because, you're not going to use, the old sippy cup or whatever. You're going to use the best you can. Yeah.
You're always gonna find ways to communicate beauty, whether it's the space or how you do something. Yeah. Right. So the worship's gonna be beautiful.
Yeah, because I know people have walked into our sanctuary and been like, "Whoa!" Right. Because our sanctuary does communicate something. It was built intentionally in a specific way. That's what churches. Well, and they say actually people who don't go to church actually want churches to look like churches now. People think that the auditorium style seating with the stage and the fancy lighting and the smoke machines and all that stuff is what's going to attract people to church. But that communicates something different too. It communicates something casual. It communicates, we're just here for a performance. Right.
Once again, we're asking, what does that confess? So even how we build our buildings, how we worship, is confessing something about who God is, about what he's here to do, what he's here to give, right? It's the notorious, the TED Talks, right? That's how a lot of churches, I can't stand TED Talks. They bother me. They just do, because it's how people view things. But that's a different discussion for a different day. So you got all that, and you got this, you're there. I've had this before at funerals, right? Yeah. People are in here, and they come up to me and say, that was awesome. I've never experienced anything like that, right? They're used to probably some dingy thing that's done on the side where there's no liturgy or mention of God, and the celebrations of life. And they're not used to this beautiful communication that happens between God and his people in the liturgy. Yeah. And I love that when they come, because it's almost like you're like in your 60s, 70s, and you're telling me you've never seen anything like this. And I'm like, oh man, is the church done? But
well, I know some people will say that to us about like Holy Week and stuff, and what we do for Holy Week is pretty much what the church has done for hundreds of years. It's varied a little bit, but the vigil and Good Friday service, those are fairly old liturgies, and it's what the church has always done, and they're beautiful. They are fun to do.
Well, it's just, I got the comments from someone who came to the Good Friday, and they just said like, wow, like that service had all the emotions. It's heavy, and yet it was beautiful, and it took you through all that to where we're now looking forward in hope to what God's going to do now. It's like, that's what it does.
Which we convey that not with just what we're saying, but what we do with those services too, with like the darkness and the black veils over everything, and like the stripping of the altar on Maundy, Thursday, and then all of a sudden everything's white on Easter, and we start out dark at the vigil. All that stuff also conveys. What you have to do it with is also conveys something. Yeah. Starting outside of the vigil, even is part of it, and so
that's beauty, right? That's part of the wonder.
We should strive for beauty just because of beauty, not because of We've lost, because I remember here in town when they were doing the building the new fire station. That was a while ago now. Anyway, but there were people who complained about how they made it into, it's a very nice looking building.
It is.
And people were saying they wasted money doing that. And I think if you're going to make a building, you should make it look beautiful. I mean, you can spend a little bit extra money to make something worthwhile to look at too. Because that also adds to the space, it adds to the town, it adds, so like having a beautiful church building, it communicates something, and it also is very obvious, we're a church.
Right.
I mean, I think that might be a church.
Right.
But, because you might see a cross or something, and it's like, it's like...
And that brings us back to when it comes to, Americans, the kind of style that we have is utilitarian, right? So it's not that practical. Utilitarian, you do something because it works.
Yeah.
We as Christians, right, well, that can have its strengths. It has its weaknesses then of, that idea of, well, that building, it doesn't have to look, that's waste of money. They're thinking that's not practical. There we go. Yeah, it is. Yeah, they just want to make it bland. And that's I would say that's not practical.
Well, it also communicates something.
Right.
I mean, it communicates that you don't really care what you're doing here. You don't think it's important.
Yeah. You want things to look good.
Yeah.
You do. So, beauty matters. And that's what we should probably kick that off, because I think the weather here is interrupting our broadcast here. So, but thank you. We'll have more questions here next month. But if you have anything else, or even just follow-ups from today, feel free to let us know.
I was thinking we should do a special episode on the Nicene Creed, since we're doing a whole series on that. So if you have questions about the Nicene Creed or the Council of Nicaea, send them our way. Maybe we'll try to do a special episode.
We'll have fun.
Okay.
Look forward to it. Well, good. Well, let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we give you thanks for the beauty indeed of the majesty of your creation that leaves us oftentimes in wonder and indeed watching its great power. Lord, be with us here today, as here in Wisconsin it's said that some severe weather will go through. Keep us safe, watch over us. Lord, remind us that each thing is a reminder that this age is coming apart. But there is an age that is coming that you are making through your Son, Jesus Christ, that we are invited into now, that will have no end. Lord, be with us, your church, your people, that as we go from death to life, that we would have the confidence to live in that confession and faith and to promote that in all that we say, do, and even how we do it. Lord Jesus Christ, grant that for your saving name. Amen. Lord, bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. Amen.